Welcome to the Radical Lifestyle Podcast, brought to you by Generation to Generation, where you will be inspired by the past, equipped for the present, and prepared for the future as we engage in conversations with people from around the world. Hello everyone, this is Andrew and Daphne from Generation to Generation, and our guest today is Lynn Green. Lynn, for people that don't know who you are, can you just say a bit about where you're from and what you do?
Grew up in Colorado. Joined Youth with a Mission to do a school of evangelism. I expected to be away for a year before finishing an engineering degree, but I'm still in missions. And I did that school in Switzerland. I ended up in Afghanistan for a while, married Lauren Cunningham's secretary, and then we ended up in England in 1970 first, and then 1971 we started Youth with a Mission, got it established legally. And we've been in and around London, home counties, basically, for these last 50 years.
And for people listening to this that say, I'd like to find out more about this guy, maybe hear from him, maybe about the organization that you're a part of, where can they do that?
Well, you could try to contact me by email, which will probably work. So it's lgreen@oval.com. So I live at Highfield Oval, and some bright spark in the 1990s realized that this would be a good domain name to get. So we acquired the domain name of Oval. So lgreen@oval.com.
Okay. We'll put that in the description box. So for people listening, that's where it will be.
You could also visit YWAM Harpenden.
Okay.
Yeah. HARPENDEN. And you can go to my website, Lynn Green.
Perfect.
So I know this seems unbelievable to us or to you, but there may just be people listening, because this goes out right across the world, who don't know what YWAM is.
It's
so
possible.
Could you explain?
Yeah. Well, when I went to YWAM, we were a grand total of, I suppose, 30 people, and 22 of us were in this school of evangelism, and then there were half a dozen or a few more scattered into different parts of the world. And it was primarily about summer outreaches. But once the training started, it just grabbed a lot of us. And within 2 years, by 1972, we had an outreach with 1,000 people at the Munich Olympics. And the growth was just incredible. Of course, that was Jesus' revolution times, you know?
Yeah.
And is it interesting? We're moving into another time like that right now. I've just been watching some worship online, and you see this enthusiasm and this commitment and this desire to change the world. And I just got a report from an evangelist about 1 million people going to his events in Europe, and like 100, I think it was 127, or no, it was more than that, churches listening to him live per Sunday. There's something rumbling again, and it's a little bit like our generation, which was fed up with the way the world was, and either going into rebellion or ending up in a real faith walk with Jesus and missions. So YWAM went on then and multiplied dramatically, largely through training, and then for evangelism. I went to a school of evangelism. And it was fantastic, and that's why I'm still here. I didn't go back to engineering because I just thought seeing people's life changed is so much more interesting than making a lot of money, which was my previous goal. So YWAM has grown now. I think we work annually. We are from 192 nations, and we have about 1,200 ministry locations globally. We train in 96 languages, so it's big, and we are tens of thousands of people, but we don't particularly count because lots of those people are in security conscious nations where they have to be kind of careful. So we don't want a database that would put them at risk. That's why I'm still mostly young people, mostly people 18, 19, 20 coming in to get a bit of training in a gap year or post-university. But then a substantial number continued to stay on.
So at a time when many people are saying, oh, this emerging generation, and look at them and how they look at they're just going off the rails. You're seeing something different.
I'm saying that, but that was exactly what my generation was. You know, we had a stable period of time post-war. I was part of the baby boom. My older sister was right at the beginning of the baby boom, 1946, all the GIs coming back home. And we had a stable and unbelievably prosperous life for 20 some years. But, we're not created for stability and prosperity. We're created for change. No matter how good life seems to be in terms of stability, prosperity, and so on, somehow it all goes bad inside, And I'm a firm believer that our inner world creates our outer world. And if you want to see the comparative value of different worldviews, work out what kind of worlds do they create for the people who believe them. So we created a stable and prosperous world, but that's not enough, the vacuum inside. So my generation went into drugs. It was the first generation of teenagers coming in when the pill was available. So sexual freedom was a big deal. Pornography really got going at that time. And we, interestingly, we pursued exactly the same stuff that the Roman Empire was pursuing at the time of the early church. I think it was Justin Martyr, listed it, greed, sexual adventure, tribalism, dividing into group identities and being at war with one another, and these were the things that they pursued then. And it's the things that our generation pursued. And of course, the thing that this generation is pursuing, and it's leaving them empty. So I went to Afghanistan because of all the young people who thought, oh, the answer is in the East. The answer is in India. It's in the ashrams. It's in the Hindu offshoots, and a lot of them got stranded in Kabul, Afghanistan, because it was a very cheap place to live, and as long as they didn't get into too much trouble with disturbing the locals, they could use what drugs they wanted and kill themselves if they wanted. So we went out to a very needy bunch of people who were just empty. And we had a wonderful, wonderful time amongst them, and then saw this huge growth. That was 1970 and 71. And then we saw this huge growth over the next few years. So that's a little bit about YWAM. YWAM today is as multinational as you get. I was, and I've lived in community. Marty and I, we had 4 kids, 11 grandkids. We're all within walking distance of one another here on the north edge of London, Harpenden. And I was in our community. We lived in community for these 50 years. And, a couple of the Africans were leading in worship, backed up by a Brazilian band and various Europeans and North Americans in it. And I thought, man, what a joy to live in multi-ethnic, multicultural, multiracial communities for these 50 years. And what a pain in the neck. If you live together, it's a whole different world than going to meetings.
Welcome to
most of our
churches.
Most of our churches consist of going to meetings, and you don't become a real disciple by going to meetings. You've got to do other stuff. You got to be engaging with one another in life, and when you're together 24/7, you can't escape. So it's a great joy, and it's always a challenge to walk in humility, teachability. And I like a little bit of what's the passage in Colossians 3 in the New Testament for everyone by Tom Wright. One of the phrases is "be prepared to put up with anything." I think, that's the walk of a disciple. Whatever.
Yeah. What was Afghanistan like when you went? Because everyone, we think about it now, it's extremely unstable, very dangerous place to go to. What was it like when you went?
It was in a relatively short period of a measure of stability, but there's always been the underlying, deeply violent tribalism in Afghanistan. So it's never been stable for very long. but they had their king, and everything was reasonably stable for just a little while there, and then the Soviets invaded, and the U.S. and others began to work with the Afghan government to bog the Soviets down and effectively to run them dry of their resources, which was a big part of the wall coming down in the late 80s. So, but prior to that, we were just in this period where it was quite a fundamental Islamic culture. So, all the women completely covered in burqas, for many of them, not a square inch of skin showing, nothing. And the women were not allowed out of the homes without a male. And a lot of the homes were just hovels. So it's extremely poor, shocking for me, having not been out of Europe or the US previously. That was a long time ago. And we didn't interface much with them. And the reason why we went is a wonderful saint by the name of Dr. Christy Wilson, his wife, Betty, who went on to be a professor at Gordon Conwell Seminary, had lived his whole life on the border of Afghanistan and is praying with his parents. And as soon as it opened up a bit, he went in, and they could get in because they were prepared to minister to the blind. And that culture really had no time for anybody with handicaps. They were just embarrassment. So they worked with the blind, and gradually more and more people came to know Jesus. So just at that point of a bit of tension rising, and we helped them build a church building, primarily for the diplomatic corps, the expats, and so on. Afghans should not have been seen going to it. Still, and it has always been that fundamental. And no sooner did we finish with that, and we had finished with our mission there to the world travelers, than the Afghan authorities came and bulldozed it. So, it was far from open. And at that point, still, if anybody who wasn't blind or otherwise handicapped, if anybody proclaimed openly a faith in Jesus, they were executed within a matter of weeks.
So
there was quite a well-known fighter pilot, getting high up in the Air Force there, who came to know Jesus and then was assassinated.
So, people might listen to this and go, well, there are people in need in, countries which are poor, but maybe are not quite as hostile. So why did you decide to go to Afghanistan? Was it that, like you said, you'd never really left the country, so you didn't actually know what you were getting yourself into? Or was it you knew what you were getting yourself into, but you were willing to pay a price? What was that like for you, and why did you go there like that?
Good question. A little bit of both, because one of the reasons why God uses young people is their ignorance. So, you don't know what you're getting into. You never experienced it. You might hear about it. You think, oh, well, it won't happen to me. And that was a bit of how it was. I didn't know that. Dr. Wilson had sent a letter to Loren Cunningham saying, any possibility of you sending a team, we are heartbroken about these world travelers dying of cholera and dysentery in our city.
And he said, have the guy that married my secretary.
Yeah. I hadn't married her yet. I had already proposed to her, though, and I wondered if he was trying to get rid of me. But no, he just read that letter out, and there were only 23 of us in that school, and what he did is he read the letter out, and he said, would you all just pray about it? And I'll check tomorrow if anybody feels they're supposed to go. So next day, he said, don't talk to each other. So we prayed, and nobody discussed that subject. And when he said, does anybody feel you're supposed to go? I was the only one. So we talked after the class, and he said, do you know where it is? I said, no. So we got out a map, and he said, do you know how you're going to get there? And I said, no. He knew I didn't have the money because I hadn't paid my school fees. So and flying there was out of the question. It was just too expensive. So he said, are you prepared to hitchhike? And I said, yeah, I'll do that. And see, that was all ignorance speaking. Ignorance and a certain amount of risk-taking, love for risk-taking and adventure.
That one for adventure,
yeah. So I ended up not hitchhiking, but rather A few other people said they wanted to join, not from that school, but I contacted a friend and he wanted to come, and another guy who's well known for early days traveling in YWAM, and another couple. And we all drove a Volkswagen minibus that we picked up. Actually, we came and met a couple of people that were going with us in London. That was my first trip to London, 1970. And so we drove from Bournemouth is where we left, and we drove all the way to Afghanistan from Bournemouth, and it's a long trip, 21 days, and it was really tough. It was really tough. It was not exciting, and I guess it tested the measure of my commitment, and my commitment fell short because when I finished that, first of all, I thought, hey, these people are not nearly as open as I thought they were. They don't want to hear about Jesus. They're open to anything but Jesus. So we had very little response that summer. But part of it was my own immaturity and ignorance and strife within our team and so on. So when I came back, we stopped back where the school had been in Switzerland, and I just wanted to go home. But Loren Cunningham spoke on Jonah and the danger of fleeing the will of God. So that's the sort of message you don't want to speak on unless you know God's given it to you, because it can be manipulative. But it wasn't. And he challenged us to go out and seek God about what the Lord wanted next, and not to run away. And the problem with me is I knew God was saying, go back to Afghanistan, and I just did not want to go. But that night in Woodland next to the YWAM base in Lausanne, I went out and said, okay, God, if Marty says she'll go, because we were engaged. Well, I didn't even say if. I knew she'd say yes. So I said, Lord, and I somehow, God speaks lots of different ways. And the way he was speaking at that time is I just knew we needed to go back and take a team of 15. So by the next summer, God had done so many miracles, and we left this time Northern Ireland in an old bus truck combination called a crew bus, and drove to Afghanistan again with a team of 15, and spent a very fruitful summer there that year.
I guess the second time you were deciding to go back, at that point you knew the dangers that you were facing. You knew how hard it was.
Exactly.
I guess, did you have to have a second time of processing what it was you were getting yourself into, or was it much easier the second time, given that you knew what you were facing?
That first experience had taught me something and it was before that we'd been learning it. I knew it, but I grounded a truth in my life when I went the first time, which is do what God says. No matter how it looks. And if God wants you to do something that's really difficult, he will tell you. And I think so many people struggle with hearing God's voice. And I think that the number one reason why people don't hear God's voice is because they've never said an unconditional yes before they hear. Yeah. And you've got to, he is God, isn't he? He's not somebody who's going to come and say, hey, I have an idea. Do you want to do this? No? Well, let's see if I can give you another one. If you say, part of being a believer, I believe, is an unconditional yes. I mean, to my mind, that's how I became a Christian in the first place. Just a few months before I joined YWAM. Well, 6 weeks. I said an unconditional yes to God. Whatever you say, I'm no longer boss of my life. I can see, I'm only 21, but I can see that I'm heading for an absolute disaster if I keep pursuing the things I'm pursuing. So whatever you say, you're the boss.
I remember, this reminds me of a trip that I took with a couple of Christian rappers from America, a guy called Sho Baraka and a guy called Jay Sun, who were, for people who know them, they were part of a group with a guy called Lecrae. And so we were going to Indonesia. Well, Lecrae was coming on this trip. He had to pull out because him and his wife were then expecting a baby. And so Sho Baraka and Jay Sun came instead. So they kind of just said yes to Lecrae. And I think at that time, I know at least one of them, but possibly both of them had never left America at that point. and they just said
right.
yes to going to Indonesia because Lecrae asked them to. And then I started to talk to them a bit, and they were like, yeah, no, we're looking forward to it. Well, eventually I got a email from them saying, hey, Andrew, we need to talk. So I said, yeah, well, we can have a chat. What's going on? Well, what I found out is that they had met one of their heroes, a guy called Paul Washer. I don't know if you know who Paul Washer is, but he's a big preacher, especially kind of within the Southern Baptist circles, and a very, very uncompromising, in your face, go and die for Jesus kind of character, right? So they were talking to him, one of their heroes, and they said, hey, Paul, we're going to Indonesia. Have you ever been? And he says, he was like, he says something like, no. And he goes, good luck. That's like committing suicide. I'll see you in heaven. So these two guys were like, whoa, our hero, who is very bold and uncompromising, even he doesn't want to go to Indonesia. This must be horrendous. So they then contact me and they're like, hey, Andrew, I think we need to talk about this situation. And we started to find out that there's persecution and people are getting killed for their faith and all this kind of stuff. And they said, they started to ask me about the trip. And I said, listen, I can't promise you that you'll be fine. That would be unwise on my part to say nothing will go wrong. I said, at the end of the day, I only want you to come on this trip if you know God's telling you to come on this trip. And if he's telling you to come on this trip, he will give us the ability to cope in the situation, whatever that situation might be.
That's right.
So these two guys went away from my very uncomforting bedside manner. And both of them came to the point where they realized they were going to die on that trip for their faith. And now people that know who they are, they have since released albums. They didn't die on that trip, but they both thought God had said to them, this is the trip. You are going to die a martyr for me. And both of them sat down with their families, with their children. They prayed together. They said their goodbyes as if they were never coming back again. And they left and they came to Indonesia. And so people would often say to me, they would say, who do you recommend within Christian hip hop circles? And those are the first two names I recommend because like you were saying, they said yes to God, whatever that meant. If that meant I die for you, so be it, I'm going. And they left and their faith, the rubber hit the road for them on that trip.
Yeah. And I think that the big thing about that training in YWAM still is, I hope everywhere, I know it is in many places, is a confidence that God wants to speak to his people. And when he leads you to do something, you do it. And when I said, I think I should go, Lauren, one of the things Lauren said, besides, do you know where it is do you know that people are being martyred there for their faith? And Christians don't last long there. And I said, no, I didn't know that. And he said, well, do you want to pray about it again? And I said, well, okay, but I think I'm supposed to go. So I'll double check. And I went because I think when we understand the nature of the Lordship of Christ, we would rather die in his service than to live a life of what if, I know I didn't go and God wanted me to. So what if I had? And, because you have these points where you can turn one way or the other. And one way is in your best self-interest and disaster in the end. The other way is in God's best interest and life in the age to come.
You've mentioned a few times about hearing God's voice and hearing God speak. And I know this is a very strong in the DNA of your training, your DTS training. It's more, it is our life, isn't it? If we cannot hear God speaking, how do we can lose our way? We don't know where we're going. And yet it is something I have found that many people struggle with. Well, look, can I hear him? Can't I hear him? Can I have him? What would you say to people who've heard you say this several times, heard your own experience of it? What would you say to people who are saying, well, it's all very well for Lynn Green, but I'm lost?
Yeah, I think everyone, and that includes me, would like to hear God's voice more clearly. I think everyone, including me, would like to hear God's voice more often.
Yeah.
We often think we need a confirming word when God says, no, you know what you're supposed to do, do it. But I'm working now with next generation. My sons in particular are involved in some really scary things. And was on a long walk with one of them yesterday. And we talked about this. We'd like to hear God's voice more often, but cling on to the last thing he said to you and just keep doing it. And I think for people who don't hear, there are a few simple reasons. And one, as I've already referred to, you got to have an unconditional yes before you ask. Because I think it was Tozer who said, God does not speak to casual inquirers.
No.
So it's wholehearted to start with. And then as you follow through, you need to keep doing the last thing he said to you with the confidence that he will tell you if he wants to change. And I think many people mess up at the beginning because they say, oh God, what are you saying? And they feel like God's spoken to them. I'm sorry to say I was in a conversation like this today, where I was there when God spoke to a guy and he's committed and said, yes, we'll do this. And today he said, I don't want to do this. I said, wait a minute. That may be the way you're feeling now, but we were in an all-night prayer meeting together not long ago. And in that prayer meeting, you said, I believe we're to do this. Don't waver. So I think we sometimes hear and then we want more confirmation before we do it. And we often use the example of Gideon, because I'm just rereading Gideon's story at the moment, because I've got the new translation by John Goldingay for the Old Testament and N.T. Wright for the New Testament. And I love some of they're very, very different translations. So it's like completely different approach to Old Testament and New. But the thing I like about the Old Testament translation is that he's done one which is very literal. And it says there, the Spirit of Yahweh clothed itself with Gideon. Mm-hmm. I like that. I really like that. But then, we read on to that story and Gideon is saying, no, God, would you please not be angry at me, but could you make the fleece wet and all the ground dry? And it happens. You can imagine him thinking, yeah, but that's kind of logical. That would happen because a lamb's fleece will draw more moisture than a flat surface around it. So God, could you make it the other way around? But see, he was going out to risk his life and the life of thousands of people. And I think if you're doing that, probably God will give you a little more confirmation. But we need to step out on what we believe God has said. Do what's in your heart. Do what you think God is saying. And if you're on the wrong track, he will either turn you aside or let you learn a really important lesson. So either way, it will be redemptive. So I believe all of us at all times need to do what we believe God is saying to us.
We have not a rule, a sort of a principle we live by. We say people sit around waiting for a yes. How much better to get moving and wait for the no?
Yes, exactly. Yes.
And that is kind of how we operate, far more on, we'll say yes, and we will trust that he will stop us or he will say a no, where you can wait for either, really. But I think it's easier for him to stop us than it is to get us going sometimes, particularly when the command is in the Bible anyway.
That's right. The go, like Lauren Cunningham used to always preach in the earliest days of YWAM, go means a change of location. And when he said in Mark 16, go into all the world and preach the gospel, it's there. And which means, go somewhere, change your location. And for the sake of the gospel.
You're mentioning that your kids are now involved with some fairly dangerous stuff. What was the difference for you in processing the danger for you and the journey that you were going to take and the processing you had to take for the danger that your kids were going to have to take?
Very similar, because I trust them to do what God is saying. So, the a couple of them are involved in things in Africa and at fairly high levels. So they're up against the level of corruption that can be lethal. People get killed over the sorts of projects that they're involved with because of the financial consequences of them. But it's the same thing. I know when God spoke to my second son about engagement with Africa, and I know the Lord opened miraculous doors. My daughter lived in Uganda for a while, and we just knew that God had called her there. I've got an interesting story on that. God, all along the way, throughout your life, God wants to refine your faith and refine your Christ-likeness, and we need to see the world as a war zone. If we think the world is meant to be a safe place of prosperity and peace, we're just wrong. That's not the biblical picture at all. The biblical picture is one of God creating a harmonious place, but we created a disharmony. And out of that disharmony comes all kinds of conflict. So we will constantly be engaged with things that are enemy-oriented. So my daughter started a thing called Friend of a Friend, which was, she knew as a YWAMer. She was about 21, I guess, 22, just got her nursing degree, I think. And she felt she wanted to connect some of those really worthy projects she knew amongst really poor people with donors in this country and in the US and so on. So Friend of a Friend, so we know people like to give where there's relationships. So she's kind of introducing people to one another. She ended up, the last leg of the journey was in Beirut. Just prior to Beirut, she had been in Dar es Salaam. And in Dar es Salaam, unbeknownst to her, she'd contracted malaria, but it was cerebral malaria, which is very often fatal. So, make a long story short, my wife knew at very short notice that she should fly to Beirut. But Sharon wasn't feeling real well, but she was okay. It was just one of those things. And so maybe she got a touch of malaria, it's going to be all right. By the time my wife got there, Sharon was really quite unwell, heavy headaches and so on. And within a couple of days, she went into a coma. And so she was in a hospital, and my wife was sitting by her bed, and she had been delirious and then into a coma. And we, her brothers, 3 brothers, and I were sitting here in this house, going through the process of giving up my daughter, our sisters, to the Lord. Say, well, Lord, we trust you. We trust you. We're asking you to save her, but we trust you. And there were some tears around the table. And Marty was praying by her bedside about all the things that Sharon had done and that she was, committed and so on. And the Lord said to her, don't pray like that. Just ask me for mercy. Nobody really deserves the grace. Ask me for mercy. She prayed for mercy. And at that point, Sharon visibly relaxed. And what happened is that Marty then went home, and Sharon had a man come into her room, shake out a fleece. Well, first of all, he walked around the room, around her bed, in the U, saying, night and day, day and night, night and day, day and night. And then he shook out a lamb's fleece, put it on the floor, lay down on the floor beside her bed, and she knew she was safe. Next morning, she was largely recovered, and within 48 hours, she was on the plane back to London. So, yeah, you go through things with your kids too, but it's just the same. Your life's precious to you. You have to be prepared to spend it for the gospel. your kids are precious to you. You have to be prepared to spend them for the gospel and trust God. And now, as it is, we constantly give thanks that we have 4 kids, all married, love their spouses, 11 grandkids, all within walking distance. Some are in the house now. If there's any interruptions, it'll be a grandkid who's not paying attention to the signs on the door. And what a blessing! But we have no right to it. We can't claim this is because we've lived a righteous life. Not at all. We say God's been very merciful to us, and his ways are beyond understanding.
Wow.
Well, that is a challenge, and on the other, it is a challenge. But if you step back and think about it, it's a logical outcome. Why wouldn't we? Why wouldn't we trust ourselves?
Exactly.
The King of Kings. Why wouldn't we want to serve him? When people say, oh, it's a sacrifice to serve him, I'm like, how can it be a sacrifice to serve the King of the universe? And we're going, oh, it's a sacrifice. I mean, when you step back, it's the only thing that makes any sense.
Or you sometimes will say about doing something for the Queen of England, for example, we would say it would be an honor to do that for the Queen. But then when it comes to Jesus, when it comes to the King, suddenly this is a sacrifice. Well, okay.
And the big difference between the Queen of England and Jesus is who knows us better?
Mm.
Exactly.
Who knows us better than ourselves? Jesus.
Yeah. Exactly.
Who loves us more than we love ourselves? Jesus. So does it make sense to give our lives over to him? It's the only thing that does make sense.
Absolutely. Totally. Well, as we start to draw this to a conclusion, I have to go to the one scripture we haven't really touched on, and that is the Great Commission. And from our perspective, the urgency of the hour of going out there. I know, like our generation, we used to talk about doing the Great Commission. We're going to do the Great Commission. And I hear a shift in this emerging generation. They're talking about finishing the Great Commission and the task that is ahead of us. So before we finish, can you just speak to that from your perspective of sending out thousands of young people? Why we're spending them out? Can you just speak to this vision of a generation that is saying we're going to finish the task?
Yeah. Well, we have mobilized tens of thousands, but we're going to have tens of millions. It's a big world. It's a very populated world. And we still have around 600 or so languages that have no bit of scripture in them. And we are really committed with many of the translation organizations and publishing organizations to get the scriptures available to everybody. And with many of the techniques now of oral translation, and the technology available to have that available for them in audio format, the process of making the entire Bible available to someone in their mother tongue, even if only 500 people or 300 people or 50 people speak that language, making that available to them in their mother tongue is hugely important. It's just emotionally, it's absolutely essential that people hear about Jesus in their mother tongue, not in some foreign tongue that they've learned or some trade language. And that can be done in a matter of months when you have the right ingredients together, as opposed to 15 years for a team of translators to go in, learn a language, commit it to writing, teach them to write, to teach literacy, etc. We're involved in all that stuff, but the oral Bible translation is certainly the breakthrough that is going to get the job done. And I think, you see, Loren Cunningham has done research on this and is convinced, and I certainly wouldn't say otherwise, that you don't see a major harvest amongst people until the Bible is available. Because when people start really coming into a spiritual experience, even if it's with the Holy Spirit and what they know of Jesus, if they don't have the scriptures, then that movement is really vulnerable. They need the scriptures. So we're engaged in that a lot, thinking that very often the precursor to the harvest becoming ripe, where people are really ready to hear the gospel, the precursor is getting the scriptures to them. And we've lived long enough, Daphne and me, that we've seen nations that were completely unresponsive. I traveled through Iran 4 or 5 times in the 70s, and that was an unresponsive nation. And now, in terms of statistics and percentages, there's never been a greater turning to Jesus by faith than amongst the Iranians all over the world. So, when we send out the workers, and when they are really committed, and when the scriptures are made available, then it's like that parable that Jesus gave, is that the farmer goes out and sows the seed, and he doesn't know how it grows. He doesn't make it grow, it grows. And when it's ripe, he puts in the sickle. And I think you have to sow the word, and then be ready to harvest when the harvest comes ripe. So the more people who are ready to go, the better. And I love it when I meet people in churches. They're not in a mission organization or anything, but they've got a connection with a country. I've got a lady who's been a really effective, highly professional, highly qualified, and successful consultant about my age. And man, God's given her a connection to Myanmar at the highest levels. And she is still meeting with them about 6 hours a day on video conferencing. Just a key person sowing the gospel into that nation. And I could tell you more stories about Myanmar. There's just so much stuff going on, and one of the things that I think is fantastic to be in the circles that I get to listen to is that you've got stories of the grace of God at work and miraculous things going on and people turning to Christ in large numbers from just all over the world. We've been on a project in the last 2 or 3 years to get a Bible in every home in Mongolia, because there'd already been a move of God amongst young people in Mongolia. I was at a meeting in Thailand just a couple of years ago. It's been a while since we traveled now, but and we had a worship team leading us from Mongolia. I thought, man, I didn't think I'd live to see this. So the harvest is ripe, but what happens if there's nobody going out to reap it? So the days of missions are still, the greatest days are still ahead of us.
So maybe we should finish with the cry that is echoed from the time of Isaiah through the centuries: who shall I send and who will go?
Yeah.
And here
am I. Send me. Yeah. Here am I.
Yeah, if you're a young person or any generation, I know that YWAM is Youth with a Mission, but there's an intergenerational culture as well within these communities. So if you're listening to this and maybe there's you feel that tugging on your heartstrings or something in this resonates with you, I recommend you check out YWAM. Again, all of those links will be in the description. So if you want to go check them out, head to the description box, hit those links. Lynn, thank you so much for taking the time. We really appreciate it. We really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity. God bless you.
Thank you for listening to this episode. If it inspired you, please rate us and subscribe on Apple or Google Podcasts, Spotify, or another podcast platform.